the weekend, but I hope people recognize that that's because it was Mother's Day weekend and I'm a mom. So I'll show this card that my daughter made me, which I think is very beautiful. Obviously, she had some help from the teachers who may have found this design on the internet. Look, it's a tulipy thing, three-dimensional card, and she says that she loves me so much. So I am a lucky mum, but my thoughts go out to people who struggle to have children, or people with strained relationships with their mothers, or people who've lost their mothers. I know there's lots of reasons to take a moment to give some care and compassion and empathy to people suffering loss or difficult compromised relationships. So welcome, thanks for joining me. My full name is Davina, which I tend to be quiet about in previous years because I was intimidated to some degree by Donald Trump being in power and the anti-democratic forces around the world being on a bit of a winning streak for a while there. But now they're on a losing streak. Hooray. I'd still say Brazil, India, to a degree, Australia and the UK have democracies that range from strongly compromised to moderately compromised, not just because of structural problems with how their democracies work, but because a pillar of democracy is a well-informed population and not a population that's being emotionally manipulated by powerful, wealthy people with strong control over branches of the media. But now that Trump's out of power, even in the context of still fascist movements around the world that are having still a measure of success in staying in power, I'm more comfortable with saying my name out loud. I'm Davina, and at some point, when my family is settled in the US, I will find some small office to run for because I want to contribute to making things better in some decisive way. I want to be a focal point for that, not just because I believe that I'm right about everything, but I think I have some life circumstances that have helped make me interested in justice, interested in forming a bulwark against fascism. Fascism isn't just fascist leaders coming to power. Fascism is an exploitative, immoral person recognizing an appetite in some part of the population for decisiveness, for bloodlust, for an elevated sense of superiority at the expense of a persecuted and despised minority group, or multiple relatively despised minority groups. And I'm going to say irrationally despised minority groups as well, because it's important for me to point out that the Jews didn't deserve fascist rhetoric. The pogroms of Europe that happened against Jews also didn't occur on a rational basis. Neither is a lot of religious infighting. It's not rational. It's just part of the human tendency to be sucked in to rationalizations that say we are the good in group, these other people are the bad out group. And sometimes those rationalizations occur on a fabricated color hierarchy system of worth. And sometimes they occur just purely on religious lines because Indians of Hindu or Muslim background have the same color skin, but have that in-group, out-group conflict that imperils the safety of all of them ultimately. But the effect being more pronounced on class lines, because wealthy people can often protect themselves from the fallout of irrational conflict. I will note that Molly's here and says awesome. I think you're saying awesome that I am broadcasting slightly on the earlier side. So thanks, Molly. If you're free, drop me a line or mention it, and I'm always happy to invite you up on the stage because you are awesome. And what else? Did I not use any good hashtags today? Let's see. I promised to talk about the NRA in a way, it's kind of good that there's a low audience level, because it means that people are feeling less politically anxious. This is fundamentally a political broadcast, so I guess there used to be a wider net so that people who were concerned, people whose needs weren't being met by the mainstream media broadcasts, they were keen to just chance upon a broadcast such as mine, which is a pro-democracy variety hour. We have singing, we have analysis, occasionally we have guests as well. I need a spiel that I can open with, so it's really more formulaic and that people can tune in knowing that there's going to be a predictable rollout of events. Now, one thing I've been working on lately is listening to Clubhouse, and they had a screenwriters group, and those screenwriters with experience who've met with some success in the industry said outlines are critical. So if anybody ever wants to help me work on my outlines, or just wants to throw in an encouraging word to say, yeah, I too have heard outlines are good and your show could benefit from working within the constraints of an outline, drop me a line. I welcome encouragement and tips for improvement. Now, the NRA, I mentioned, they have a Mother's Day message, and the Mother's Day message was a post featuring a mother and a child both holding a gun with the message, "Mama didn't raise a victim." Now, I'm sure we can find lots of things to complain about, that the NRA is promoting gun ownership and that gun over-proliferation in America has helped give thieves more targets for theft, has helped endanger the lives of people, because when gun proliferation is more widespread, then just statistically speaking, there's going to be more people who form that 1% subset of gun owners who should not have access to guns, because they will kill somebody when they get a chance. They're psychologically vulnerable enough to work themselves up into a rage, or to encounter material that helps them work themselves up into a rage, and that they will be responsible for death of some kind, whether it be a death that's limited to people they love, or whether it will be a more wide-ranging mass death event when they take a gun out to a public space and begin to indiscriminately kill bystanders. Indiscriminately or discriminately attack Asian American women in a day spa. So yes, we can criticize the NRA, and that's very valid. I want to dig into what is the NRA trying to achieve when they have a slogan, "Mama didn't raise me to be a victim." I would say that they are contributing to and amplifying a culture war conflict that we should note has an intergenerational basis, because there have been changes in the way that many people approach life over the years. So new generations are more likely to speak to or to adopt behavior relating to sentiments that say, "Don't mistreat me, I have rights." And older generations tend to say, "We're concerned that you don't have any focus on your responsibilities. We have concerns that you're hyper-focused on your feelings, and that you fail to acknowledge that your feelings are subjective. Instead, your feelings have calcified, and you give significant legitimacy to how you feel without acknowledging that other people might be in similar circumstances and not have the same feeling. Other people might have different narratives with which to explain their lives, so they won't have the same intensity of feeling as you have, because maybe if they feel the parents mistreated them, their focus will also be on their parents provided for them." So there's this intergenerational fear, I think, of younger people, that they will hate and resent older people because that is the part of the celebration of emotions that gives victimhood a bit more of a currency, because your voice is more legitimized if you can describe how you've been persecuted in some way, be it by your parents, be it by systemic racism, etc. So some of that anti-woke fear I will decry as overkill, but I'm still interested in how those opinions are formed. And I'm prepared to entertain the idea that some of the modern approach to the world can be pushed back against, that we can say to people, your emotions have validity to a degree, but let's still give ourselves room to be flexible and to acknowledge that sometimes our emotions are just our perspectives, and sometimes our perspectives are contingent on the individual way in which we see the world. That is a subjective truth rather than an objective truth. The strengths of young people nowadays is that they're very accepting. So they're very accepting of diversity, they're very accepting and encouraging of each other. So someone said they were in a Target store looking at gay pride merchandise, and they heard a young person, a group of teenagers, approach and say, oh, I love this stuff, gay stuff, I love it. And then they looked at this man and said, hello, fellow gay. And it just sounded like they were joyous and really embracing of difference. And that's nice. That's nice for them, that people don't have to be in the closet. There is much less compunction for younger people to be in the closet. It's actively embraced for them to be authentic and to come out of the closet and to express their lack of conformity to established binary ideas of men, how men should be men and how women should be women. So again, I will note that there's this potential intergenerational suspicion and contempt being set up there, which is that older people might feel, I had to be a man and I had to do these certain manly tasks, and I was forcibly signed up to be conscripted into the army. So why should you get to just say, I don't feel like a man, therefore I am not one? It's a bit like gatekeeping of victimhood. If we were oppressed in these ways, then you shouldn't get to enjoy liberty. Because who knows, maybe you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater, and maybe I reconciled my suffering to myself by saying society's stability depends on me just sucking it up and being a man, even when I'd rather dress up like a lady and quietly put on makeup in the privacy of my own home. So it's interesting, that contrast, because there's often this suspicion of younger people that they're overly indulgent and that they are being too liberal with having victimhood as a currency. But what if some of the antagonism towards younger people is derived from older people being the gatekeepers of suffering? So maybe the true victims, or the true people championing victimhood here, are older people who say, things can't change because I suffered to keep society steady. I've been told that I had to suffer to keep society steady. Therefore, my victimhood has a purpose, and you are not allowed to free yourself from the shackles of that societally imposed victimhood. You have to suffer because I suffered. And that's interesting to think about. Has anybody else noticed any symptoms of intergenerational, not warfare, but intergenerational conflict, intergenerational contempt even? I've decided contempt is a very significant driving factor in human affairs because of what we now we have some very clear-cut examples of how contempt for others drives absolutely catastrophic and ruinous outcomes. So Donald Trump, his urge to preserve his own political power, when married with a contempt for various demographic groups, resulted in this very exploitative and very destructive approach to managing a pandemic. So we should all know by now that public health messaging requires a lot of consistency to help iron out people's individualistic tendencies to say, well, I saw a YouTube video that said differently. You have to have consistency of messaging from the top down. Not just Dr. Fauci saying wear masks and socially distance, but also the president and also officials at local levels. You need consistency so people get reassured by the idea that The government and public health officials are all on board. And when Donald Trump acted to undermine public health messaging, when Donald Trump acted as if he was just intuitively capable of finding the answer to the problem of COVID, first of all, by saying, my answer to the problem of COVID is to recategorize COVID as not a problem. It's being overplayed, he said, by the media. It's been overhyped. It's the new Democratic hoax. Sean's here and says, Happy Mother's Day. Thank you, Sean. I'll show you my beautiful flower card from my daughter, who kept pretending to propose to members of my family with this. She would kneel down and say, please marry me. And then you kind of had to say no to her, because we worked out that if you said yes to her, she would then make you kneel down on the floor, and then she would say she was going to kiss you to cement the ceremony of marriage. And then she would find herself unable to do that because she didn't want to marry her family members for real. So she would then sort of look around and say, well, this is awkward. So it was kind of like feeding into a comedy bit for her. She's such a comedian at 6 years of age. So that's my Mother's Day story. And I'll go back now to what I'm saying with intergenerational conflict and also the fruits of contempt. So despising demographic groups, making them the other, and then designating them as worthy of contempt or disdain proves to be very deadly when you have people in charge. So there's a report that came out today as well that said Donald Trump, or the Trump administration, purposefully withheld aid from Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, which is obviously something that leads to very deadly results for the people of Puerto Rico. There were diabetics who died because power lines being down meant medicines couldn't be easily transported across the country. There were people who were dependent on oxygen dispensing machines who died because of lack of electricity, because of lack of federal aid from the government. Even though Puerto Rico is part of America, it's not a state, but it's an American territory, and it is owed assistance by the federal government. And if the federal government had been acting functionally and not a fascist-style government, operating on the basis of contempt and derision for people of color, and knowing that they would be winning support from their intuitively racist base if they did withhold aid from the people with brown skin in the American territory of Puerto Rico. Sean liked my story. He said, lovely. Phil notes that 2022 and 2024 still worry you. Until proven otherwise, you don't believe Trumpism is going away. I think that's a very valid concern, Phil, and I'm with you on that. A lot of people say, traditionally speaking, the energy of post-presidential election makes negative bipartisanship increased turnout. So whichever party won the presidential election, the opposite voters from the opposite side of the political aisle will turn out in strength and numbers and will change the composition of the House. They will swing results the other way. And Democrats don't have a huge buffer for the House, so they could lose control of the House and they could lose control of the Senate in 2022. Now, I will note that there's some unusual political circumstances in that there was an insurrection. There was an effort to overthrow the government that Republicans are now trying to cover up. But some Republicans voters have noticed that that happened, and they are not necessarily ready to excuse Donald Trump, and they're not necessarily ready to excuse their own political party for enabling that. So as hard as the conservative media machine might be working to valorize the people who participated in that bloody, violent insurrection, as hard as the conservative media machine might be working to continue to persuade their voters to overlook the 62 court cases that proved there was nothing to substantiate Trump's claim of a stolen election. to overlook the Supreme Court decisions, the Ninth District Court decisions at all levels of the American judicial system that proved there was no substance to Donald Trump's claims, that he was in fact full of feces, and that Republicans jumped on board with that, even as the court cases continued to find against Trump, because they were nakedly pursuing power, and that they were aware that what might happen was the overthrow of democracy. And they might have just gone along with it. They might have said, oh, well, whoops, the insurrection happened, but that was just some frustrated people. Now the electoral college system has been thrown back to the states. Oh, and look, whoops, some Pennsylvania officials have now felt sufficiently pressured and compelled to decertify the official election results in Michigan, maybe Georgia as well. And they've felt the voice of the people through the actions of those few thousand people who overthrew the Capitol and who held legislators hostage. We'll just go with that, because Donald Trump's in office. He's very powerful, and whoops, Mike Pence is dead now. They hung him. We're just going to have to pick up the pieces and go on with our democracy, our managed democracy at this point. Whoops, sorry, Mike Pence's family. I don't know exactly how they thought they were going to proceed after the insurrection. Donald Trump ideally would have preferred a military coup, but the good news is that there were enough responsible Republican people or Republican-leaning people who sabotaged Donald Trump's efforts to inspire the military to back his coup. So the op-ed written by 10 former defense secretaries, we now know Liz Cheney was helping organize that, or she was motivated to organize that, because she saw what Donald Trump was doing, that he was working to instigate a coup. He was making his wishes very clear in terms of the taped calls that he was making to elected officials in Georgia. And so the Georgia ones were taped. We haven't heard the conversations he made to election officials in Pennsylvania, but he was trying on everything that he could to overthrow the results of the election and stay in office for an unearned second term. Jeff is here and says hi. Hi, Jeff. Phil says Trumpism seems to be growing and strengthening. I'm hearing that. I heard Rick Wilson say that he thinks it's juvenile to describe Trump as the former guy because he thinks it's wishful thinking. I think it's got a binary outcome, really. In one way, it keeps Trump's name out of social media outcomes. So he wants attention, and he's still quite starved for it in the overall sense of the word. He doesn't have provocative tweets to grab the headlines of the mainstream media. As such, his effort to establish a new social media platform is just like his own private blog. He doesn't get the same media attention that he did, but the people who supported him have a lot of reasons to have to admit that they're wrong. And that higher level of motivation seems to be pushing them to be more hysterically opposed to reality. Such is their commitment to not admitting to having been wrong about Trump. Such is their commitment to not admitting that they were wrong about the Democratic Party. Such is their commitment to not admitting that they were wrong about the election, and that the court system upheld democracy, and that the election system functioned as it was supposed to. Yeah, so there's a big pushback from people who have a stronger appetite for lies, because the insurrection proves that they are guilty of helping to overthrow America, that they were supporting someone, enabling someone who helped injure 140 police officers, which is quite an extraordinary event in American history. So do we think that makes Trump stronger, or do we think that just gives energy to the craziness of what is hopefully a shrinking pool of Trump supporters? And when I say shrinking, I don't mean substantially shrinking, but a bit shrinking, because whilst we are shocked by reporting that says 70% of Republicans believe that Trump truly won the election, which is a very high number to believe something that's very absolutely not true, that's very absolutely a lie that serves Donald Trump and serves Republicans that prefer to keep power any which way, even at the expense of democracy and the lives of police officers, etc. But that 30%, that's not just, say, 30% of Democrats being dissatisfied with Joe Biden for some reason. That's 30% of Republicans who think, yeah, Joe Biden won the election, which is a big schism between their compatriots who say, definitely not. Biden definitely didn't win the election. Trump's definitively the president. And any day now, maybe he'll find a way to take power back and Joe Biden will be impeached. I mean, when Democrats wanted Donald Trump impeached, there weren't many people under the illusion that that would remove all Republicans from office. That was just going to get the information out there that Donald Trump was guilty of corruption. And if it managed to succeed in the Senate as well as the House, if the Senate managed to convict him after the House had impeached him, then Mike Pence would have been the president. So Trump, as an authoritarian leader and cult figurehead, he would have been out of power and Democrats would have been happy and relieved. Mike Pence is still part of the conspiracy to manipulate Republican voters and so maintain minoritarian control over the United States. Illegitimate minoritarian control, because we know that they achieved office in the first place through illegal cooperation with the Russian government, with Russian intelligence operatives who sought to weaken America, say, and get a leader who spends so much time committing crimes and covering them up that he would see the pandemic merely as a tool to lie to people more and say, oh, these other people say they want you to obey science and wear masks, but they're trying to take your freedom, and I am the true guardian of freedom, and I'm going to use this pandemic to celebrate my own role as the deliverer of the American people, the deliverer of greatness to the American people, because I renounce this so-called reality of a pandemic. Phil notes that this fight and voter suppression going on could be a dress rehearsal for the next election. We need HB1. Yes, I will note that it's now S1 because that legislation passed the House. It won. It's done in the House. It's no longer HB1. It's S1. Christopher Lucas says, Happy Mother's Day, Dav, and to all mothers present. Thank you, Christopher. Phil worries that someone like Josh Hawley, who's a bit smarter and more disciplined, could take Trump's playbook and run with it. Trump's not very well educated, but he has Machiavellian street smarts in relation to how to weaponize American racism, how best to weaponize the racism of the American electorate in electorally college significant states. So he's not as dumb as a box of hammers. He's not as dumb as his reputation. America just has a portion of the population that fundamentally believe in the meritocracy and believe that people in government should be well educated. Trump certainly isn't at all well educated. He's ignorant on history and science, and that's some of the reason why he pretends to be good with science and touts his own abilities and says he could have been a doctor. He just has this amazing ability to understand science and tries to show his intuitive grasp of science by doing what science sometimes does, to make hypotheses by extrapolating from one piece of evidence to suggest a solution to a different problem. So Trump was trying to show off his ability to think like a scientist by saying, well, disinfectant kills germs on surfaces, and our scientists have recently established disinfectant is really good at killing COVID on surfaces. What if we use that as an internal cleaning mechanism to get rid of COVID? So he was hoping for applause for his science, his grasp of science. And of course, he doesn't grasp a basic piece of biological knowledge, which is we have bacterial proliferation in our own bodies that's full of healthy bacteria. And if you apply disinfectant internally, you will kill off your own bodily systems that you need to function. And so you don't do that. So Donald Trump doesn't have a grounding in science, in biological facts, which is why his effort to show off his credentials as someone making a hypothesis. He knew he didn't intend to say, go drink bleach right now. He was trying to get credit. He was looking at Dr. Birx. What's the scarf lady's name? Birx. I think it's Birx. He was looking at her for applause to say, you're so smart, Donald Trump, and so scientifically minded. She had previously given him props and said he's so good at getting across scientific data that we present to him. He really is such a good scientific thinker. So she had already boosted his narcissistically swollen ego by saying that. And he's on some level aware that he's not thoroughly educated, that he's cheated his whole academic career, that his eldest sister, Elizabeth Trump, drove him all around town trying to find any college that would take him, and that he had a friend sit his SAT exam results for him. So he knows on some level that his credentials, his educational credentials are poor, but as I often bring up, he did have a book of Hitler's speeches that used to live in his bedside cabinet that he would presumably read fairly frequently. And his first wife, Ivana Trump, had mentioned that in the divorce deposition and said that he had this book. A journalist from Vanity Fair in 1991 questioned Trump about it and said, rather smartly, rather intelligently, she said, who gave you that book of Hitler's collected speeches? And he said, who told you that? It was a Jewish friend, Marty Davis. So the journalist went to Marty Davis, who was a producer at Paramount, and said, did you give Donald Trump that book? And he said, yes, I did. It wasn't Mein Kampf. It was Hitler's collected speeches, My New Order. And I thought he would find it interesting. And also, I'm not Jewish. The Vanity Fair journalist published that detail then in an article about Trump and things about Trump you don't know. Donald Trump then poured a glass of wine over her at a function. So even though people don't take that as a thoroughly confirmed anecdote about Trump, it is true. There's various corroborative details there that he said Marty Davis gave it to him, and Marty Davis agreed that he gave him that book. So it's a confirmed detail about Trump. He read Hitler's speeches. He is a student of fascism. He is a student of fascist rhetoric and public manipulation. So even though I say low levels of biological factual knowledge, low levels of political knowledge, he doesn't really know how America's politics works. He often got frustrated by the limitations on the role of the president. But that's not just a frustration from ignorance, that's also an aspirational frustration. Donald Trump worked to consolidate the power vested in the executive branch, worked to reduce the impact and influence of Congress by avoiding the checks and balances, by doing things like just going around Congress, going behind Congress's back. He used people like Rudy Giuliani to speak to the president of Ukraine about how they were going to withhold the congressionally appointed funds of military assistance, $400 million being offered to the government of Ukraine to help them defend themselves from Russian attack, because Ukraine is a US ally, and that's why Congress had voted to give that money to Ukraine. Trump just weakened Congress by going behind Congress's back to say, oh, you know what, you can't have that money. He put a stay on that money, which he's only allowed to do if he has some legitimate concern about America's interests. Instead, Donald Trump pursued his own self-interest, put a hold on that money, and was not challenged. So Donald Trump had so consolidated executive power, not by changing any laws, but by pure ambition. I think I should be in charge of everything, so I will intimidate the officials whose job it is to put a check to illegitimate exercise of power. Phil notes that Hawley is fundraising very successfully from small donors. He's dangerous. He is. He's dangerous, but he's also he's not someone who can easily lead a cult like Trump. And I'll tell you why. Trump is synonymous with wealth in the imagination of a significant amount of American television watchers. And do you know how many people in America watch television? It's quite a lot. It's quite a lot. And as with all political matters, there's a bell curve of public attention paid to various things. There's a middle of the American public electorate, like the large blob of the bell curve, together with a smaller bell tail ends of the bell curve, where people have perhaps more intensity of feeling or higher levels of acquaintance with philosophical approaches to politics. In the middle are just people who watch TV and try and go about their daily lives. And those kind of people are quite likely to have watched The Apprentice, or at least a significant number of them, and have had Donald Trump established in their mind as synonymous with success. So when you say, oh, people who vote Republican are being selfish and racist, sometimes they would be able to rationalize to themselves, I want, for the good of the country, there to be a responsible leader in charge who's good with money. Now, this is often overlooked, but a majority of the American people rejected Donald Trump. He lost the popular vote by 2.8 million to Hillary Clinton. So even with sexism and racism as factors influencing people's decisions, and television and Donald Trump's false reputation for business success, he still lost. He lost in the sense of most functional democracies that allow the popular vote to be exercised and to help mitigate against an outcome of a tyrant gaining office, because he's able to smarm his way to the top, because he's able to say, don't worry, I hate the same people you hate. I deride Mexicans. I deride undocumented migrants. I'm derisive about all manner of people, and let's be unified together in contempt for those people, and also unified together in some type of false positivity where we say, hey, any criticism of America is insufferable. Any kneeling during the national anthem is disloyal and treasonous, etc., etc. Let's unify around two things. Fake positivity. So American exceptionalism precludes any criticism or any concern raising about structural racism or systemic racism. And let's unify around also our racist impulses against Mexican people and migrants. Marsha's here and says, hello, Davina. Hi, Marsha. Nice to see you. Little White Lies suggests that Trump learned about politics from his dad. Just pay them off and say whatever you want and look cool. Certainly, appearance, the supremacy of appearance is an important facet of fascism, and that has been the case throughout history. Hitler has a reputation for making trains run on time, but historians will tell you, if you dig a bit deeper, he was an incompetent leader who slept in late, read newspapers about himself, thought about what the public wanted to see, and wasn't really concerned with governing Germany for its own interests. He was interested in preserving and adding to his own power by catering to the worst impulses and the worst emotions of the German people and creating a kind of faux unity around that idea of there being a color hierarchy in which Germans were at the top. And German dignity had been injured by the actions of communists and Jews, making Germany lose World War I, so that honor could be restored and the results of World War I could be reversed by Germany unifying together and trying to replay out that war with a different outcome. So even though World War II had ended not that long ago and presumably would have been associated with suffering for a lot of people, Hitler's like, let's relitigate World War I, restore Germany's honor, and defeat the enemies who caused our downfall in that First World War, namely Jews and communists. Democracy is towards a more perfect union, and fascism is towards a more perfect manipulation of ego-wounded people in the electorate. Now, an article that I'd like to raise that people might not have seen, it wasn't particularly popular, found out that a lot of the people who participated in the insurrection, a lot of the Trump supporters who said, I know what's a smart thing for me to do, go to the Capitol, participate in a rally, and then bring weapons to attack people. A lot of them had experienced financial instability. A lot of them had been hit with large tax debts, had conducted their affairs in a way that they were found guilty of fraud and lost their businesses. A lot of them had lost significantly in their lives. And those people had very exaggerated sense of grievance towards the state. I mean, considering they'd just been ruled by Trump for 4 years, you'd think they might have some degree of concern that Trump was part of that state, but no. Trump is always, in their eyes, anti-establishment. So he is never responsible for any ways in which the state hurts them. He's always the reformer, the anti-establishment rogue agent who might not have made everything better yet because his enemies are still stymieing his reform efforts to drain the swamp and to make everything better in their lives. Yes, so their economic anxiety. Edward Windsor, please don't come here and say goodnight when I'm in the middle of a broadcast. It is disruptive, and I'll mute you if you do it. If you want to leave, you can leave quietly, but you haven't said anything else. So to just come here and say goodnight, if you said hello first, I'd probably tolerate that behavior. So last warning, mute you next time you do that. Good night to you, sir. Towards a more perfect union is an acknowledgement that democracy is forever a work in progress, that you can never just grade democracy and expect that to stand for more than a minute. There are always more twists and turns. And a lot of the twisting and turning at the moment, we have to acknowledge, is Republicans acting like criminal children who should go to juvenile detention. Oh, I don't like this metaphor. Republicans acting like people who've gotten away with illegitimate, unearned power for too long because of the affirmative action for wealthy white people baked into the Constitution. Part of the compromises that underpinned the Constitution to show them that even though lots of people had abolitionist inclinations, some of the founding fathers had that they would respect the wishes of slave owners to preserve their access to massive wealth, preserve their access to the empire building that was occurring through slavery profiteering. And hey, Knowledge is here. Thanks, Knowledge. Thanks for tuning in. So yes, when people say the 3/5 compromise, that had nothing to do with even acknowledging that Black Americans were deserving of any rights at all. It didn't grant Americans 3/5 of the privilege. It didn't grant Black Americans 3/5 of the privileges that were awarded to white people. The 3/5 compromise is purely a mathematical term for the leveraging of political influence of people in low population states. I'll say low population meaning low voting population. High population numbers of slaves generating huge profits for people in those states who owned heaps of agricultural land that had relatively few white voters living on that land, but heaps of enslaved people whose suffering, whose misery, whose lack of freedom were traded to generate exorbitant profits for white slave owners, white wealthy landowners who simultaneously owned multiple slaves as well as multiple acres. Now, those owners were powerful people, and their compliance was necessary to the founding of America. Their buy-in was necessary to have the United States as a functional nation. So American status as a global superpower arose from the ability of the founding fathers to wink and nod to slavery and say, don't worry, we'll make sure you have an extra thumb on the scale of American democracy so that those people in the North who might favor abolition never get to bully you into surrendering your slaves and surrendering the system of massive wealth generation that you have been able to establish. Wink, wink, nod, nod. We understand that America's wealth and America's status, in a way, has arisen because of this style of economic functionality. Knowledge thinks that I'm challenging that statement, knowledge, of saying 3/5 is also what they considered the slaves to be, 3/5 of a person. I'm challenging it because I'm saying, and I realize I didn't finish my explanation, 3/5 meant they allowed 3 out of every 5 slaves, enslaved people, because I want to humanize these people who were still people who just were deprived of their freedom and a lot of things by that system and by those system of people profiting from chattel slavery. 3 out of every 5 slaves had their bodies tallied in the total of what is the population of this state. Because, there's a degree of proportionality to America's political system. The House of Representatives, how many representatives each state has, is predicated on their population tally. How many people are in your state? And now it means how many voting people are in your state. And then it meant how many voting people are in your state, and what's 3/5 as a percentage? 20, 60. And 60% of the numbers of slaves in your state. It is purely a mathematical way of swelling the numbers in states that were wealthy because they had a lot of slaves and a small number of white people making huge numbers of profits. Because the profit margins on any enterprise you run where you don't pay your workforce, and if you rape your workforce, they'll produce more, they'll expand your workforce. That just was a technique. It was in no way, shape, or form granting any rights to the enslaved people. They didn't have 3/5 of the rights of white people. They weren't allowed to read a little bit or vote a little bit. No voting. Illegal to read and write. Illegal to do anything that was a right entrenched into the law for white people. So it's a very, very common misapprehension to just have shorthand to say we were considered less than. It's true. They were definitely considered less than, but they weren't considered anything nearly as high as 3/5 of a white person. That's just that there was a mathematical trick, a concession to slave owners built into the Constitution to say, don't worry, we will let the slavery profiteering states triumph over those states where some of the people are more concerned that slavery is immoral and that we should abolish it. The abolitionist states. It's not as if I say the North was free from racism or free from people who thought maybe slavery was worthwhile tolerating, even if they didn't actively think there should be slavery in their state. The North was composed of people who were okay with slavery and people who owned slaves as well. I mean, Alexander Hamilton lived in the North, didn't he? And his wife's family owned slaves, and in his will at his death, there were some servants left in his will. And servants in your will mean slaves who are your property that you are passing on in your will. Yes, so knowledge knew it had something to do with voting too, and now you know what? That, yes, popular misapprehension that it's to do with granting slaves at least some status, 3/5 of the status of a white person. No embedded status in that compromise as well. That compromise is entirely about giving extra political representation to states where there were more slaves than voters. They were allowed to swell the tally of population in their states by falsely including slave numbers, 60% of slave numbers, to that population tally to make those states seem as if they had more people and should get higher numbers of representatives in the House, which is an extraordinary betrayal of the people in the US who had enough of a functional conscience to see that slavery was a moral outrage. Yes. Marsha said she went to elementary school in the 1960s. Anything we were taught about slavery only happened in the South. We never learned it was in the North as well. Whereabouts did you go to elementary school in? Do you live in Rhode Island? I've forgotten where Marsha lives. Sorry, Marsha. And Perry Pilot, who I know is English, but he has an American history detail as well to say those God-fearing Confederate Christians even wrote a slave Bible for slaves to worship where they edited out all the parts about anti-slavery. Now that's interesting because I'm under the impression strongly that it was illegal to learn to read if you were a slave. So maybe there was some part of history where that happened. I'm imagining that maybe that happened after abolition. So maybe they didn't want freed slaves to be angry about how even in the Christian Bible, it says slavery was wrong. So let's find out when that happened. Bible. Written for slaves. Without passages. Relating to slavery. Okay. All right, so I'm seeing that come up on history.com that slaves, Bibles given to slaves, omitted most of the Old Testament. So the so-called slave Bible told of Joseph's enslavement, but left out the parts where Moses led the Israelites to freedom. When slavery was legal, its proponents often justified it with the Bible, specifically a verse that tells servants to obey their masters. There were also a lot of verses that abolitionists could use and did use to argue against slavery, but you wouldn't find those in the heavily redacted slave Bible. Most of the Old Testament is missing, and only about half of the New Testament remains. The reason? So that the enslaved Africans in the Caribbean islands of Jamaica, Barbados, and Antigua couldn't read or be read anything that might incite them to rebel. The slave Bible was actually titled Parts of the Holy Bible Selected for the Use of Negro Slaves in the British West India Islands. Whoever the slave Bible's editors were, they were really highlighting portions that would instill obedience. A curator at the Washington, D.C. Museum of the Bible, which has a copy of the slave Bible on display. The first slave Bible was published in 1807, 3 years after the Haitian Revolution ended. That revolution was the only slave revolt in history in which enslaved people... Oh, it's playing. There we go. Uh, 3 years after this. Okay, so there was a slave revolution in 1804. The only slave revolt in history in which enslaved people successfully drove out their European oppressors to form a new nation. And it increased American and European paranoia that the people they oppressed would one day rise up against them. The Haitian Revolution could have been a motivation for publishing a Bible without the part where Moses tells the Pharaoh to let my people go. Missionaries and planters may have thought that Christianity, at least certain parts of it, would protect against revolutions by teaching enslaved people to respect their masters. Okay, so the slave Bible might have been to be read aloud to slaves, to be able to enable missionaries and so forth to read to slaves without exciting them to rebel. Passages that emphasized equality between groups of people were also excised. This included, there is neither Greek nor Jew, there is neither bond nor free, there is neither male nor female, for ye are all one in Christ Jesus. The slave Bible also doesn't contain the book of Revelations, which tells of a new heaven and earth in which evil will be punished. In contrast, one of the passages that remained was one that proponents of slavery loved to cite. Servants, be obedient to them that are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in singleness of your heart, as unto Christ. Wow. Well, that's fascinating stuff. I'm so grateful to you guys for telling me about it so that I could learn something and then open up the History Channel, the history page, and see more things, as apparently the last slave ship survivor gave an interview in the 1930s, which just surfaced. So that's fascinating as well, and shows us, compacts history together to make us realize that, yes, if the last slave ship survivor was still giving an interview in 1930, we're closer to slavery than many of us might imagine. So what I'm taking from that story about the slave Bible, first of all, what was news to me about the Haitian Revolution, where slaves were actually successful in repelling Europeans, but also there's probably a market to make up a Bible that's the exact opposite of the slave Bible, that just has those passages that slave masters decided to tear out of the Bible. So just a condensed Bible version that just has the things that say, don't put up with being enslaved. And also wrongdoers will be punished at some point, to remind you to be mad at people who have done things deserving of punishment, who have done things that dehumanize, hurt, and oppress others. So Knowledge El Shabazz is also introducing me to something new. He's noting a name called Nat Turner. So that sounds like something I need to know about as well. An American preacher who had a rebellion of enslaved Virginians that took place in Southampton County, Virginia, in August 1831. Cause of death, execution by hanging at age 31. So he was born in 1800. The rebels killed between 55 and 65 people, at least 51 of whom were white. The rebellion was put down within a few days, but Turner survived in hiding for more than 2 months afterwards. There was widespread fear in the aftermath, and militias organized in retaliation to the rebels. The state executed 56 enslaved people accused of being part of the rebellion, and many non-participant enslaved individuals were punished in the frenzy. I can imagine the fear of losing, not only losing slavery, but potentially losing one's life because you're killed by rebelling slaves, would have been enough of an inducement for people to crack down really heavily and kill a lot of people, a lot of slaves, even if they weren't involved at all, as a deterrent. I'm thinking, of course, about not of course, but I happen to be thinking of the Iraq War and how the attack on America motivated a lot of Americans to support a Republican administration who chose to quite transparently lie about weapons of mass deception just in order to get to use military power in that way as a deterrent. Like, don't even attack America, anybody. Look at us. We're going to just kill 100,000 people in Iraq, and we'll try and minimize what we've done and say it's mission accomplished and it's all useful and good, and people will nod their head, but what it's really doing is trying to satisfy bloodlust, trying to satisfy the anger and fear of people who've been attacked. So approximately 120 enslaved people and free blacks were killed by militias and mobs in the area. State legislatures passed new laws prohibiting education of enslaved people and free black people, restricting rights of assembly and other civil liberties for free black people, and requiring white ministers to be present at all worship services. Do you know what? I can imagine that happening after 9/11, except I don't think it did. But can't you just imagine Republicans passing a law that says there has to be a Christian monitor at Islamic religious services? Knowledge Shabazz notes that his state in Virginia still has on the books slave codes as well. Yes, there's a certain inertia to things, even slavery and rationalizations for slavery and laws passed to protect slavery. So I wonder what some of those slave codes are that are still on the books in Virginia. Oh, Edward Windsor says, he says good night as his hi. Well, I accept that apology, Edward, and I'm sorry I took umbrage at your comment. If that's your way of saying hello, I'd prefer it if you change it, but at the same time, I won't treat that as purposeful trolling anymore. It's just your way of saying hello, eh? All right, Edward. I accept that there was no ill intent on your part. Little White Lies tells us that Nat Turner's skin was made into a purse and his bones were turned to oil. That's plausible. It was a 4-day rebellion. Virginia, Southampton County, Virginia, a plantation area with more blacks and whites. So Nat Turner is pointing out, look, there's more of us than them. Why should people be enslaved by these white people when we are more numerous? Turner knew little about, he was an enslaved preacher. He knew little about the background of his father, who was believed to have escaped from slavery when Turner was a young boy. So his mother was enslaved, but his father had escaped. So he knew that story, that escape was possible, and that was why he didn't have a father in his life. He learned how to read and write at a young age. He was identified as having natural intelligence and quickness of apprehension, surpassed by few. He grew up deeply religious and was often seen fasting, praying, or immersed in reading the stories of the Bible. He frequently had visions, which he interpreted as messages from God, and these visions influenced his life. He escaped slavery at age 21 from Samuel Turner, his captor. He returned a month later after becoming delirious from hunger and receiving a vision which told him to return to the service of his earthly master. He often conducted services preaching the Bible to his fellow enslaved people, who dubbed him the prophet. So I'm presuming Turner had his hands on a copy of the Bible that was not the slave Bible with the extracted passages, which included most of the Old Testament and half of the New Testament. Turner garnered white followers such as Etheldred T. Brantley, whom Turner was credited with having convinced to cease from his wickedness. So a white man who was persuaded by Nat Turner to perhaps stop enslaving people. He was convinced that God had given him the task of slaying my enemies with their own weapons. In 1830, Joseph Travers purchased Turner, and Turner later recalled that he was a kind master who placed the greatest confidence in him. He witnessed a solar eclipse on February the 12th, 1831, and convinced it was the sign for which he was waiting. So he started preparations for an uprising against the enslavers in Southampton County by purchasing muskets. Well, what interesting history we're learning today. Bear with me. Hello, darling. I am not finished broadcasting. Okay, I'll call you back soon. Bye-bye. Phil says I sound Canadian with the eh. I've been listening to Canadians a bit more lately. Okay, so my instincts were right. The Edward Turner person is what I would describe as a troll, but what I really mean is very racist. So some people survive with so little they also considered slaves. No, dude, no racist person. If they're just very impoverished, they're very impoverished. They are not literally owned by another person, with their children also belonging to an owner, with the ability for it to be legal to punish them, beat them, and tell them what they can or cannot do. Okay, so there is a degree of constrainment that comes along with extreme poverty, but it is entirely quantifiably different to slavery. So I'm going to mute you because you can listen and benefit from people who know better than you, but we won't encourage people to spread racist lies. And that's just a matter of principle. It's not a matter that relates to the First Amendment, because the First Amendment and the protection of speech is the protection of your right to speak your truth speak your perspective or your set of alternate facts without being oppressed by your government. And because I'm not your government, don't bother to complain that I'm oppressing or denying you your First Amendment rights, because you don't have the right to speak anywhere you choose. And in this forum of ostensibly decent people, we let decent people participate in the conversation, and we let indecently racist people listen. You can listen, and that's fine. So he's trying to make these other excuses for slavery by seeking to minimize the whole industry of slavery by saying there's a history of enslavement internally within some African countries, which is irrelevant to the judgment that we're placing on the amassing of great wealth in the United States through the mechanism of enslaving Black people from African countries. So I can just click mute user like this, and then we don't have to tolerate that person. Absolutely. This is my room and I make the rules. I'm also not yet part of the government. Once and if I find a way to garner enough public support that I could be elected to some public position, then you could say, hey, you can't turn off my microphone. I have free speech. I think people are still allowed to have guidelines even in public meetings, but it's in a way a democratic strength that Americans are often devoted to insisting that their rights be honored. It's also an American weakness that a significant number of people don't appreciate or understand the systematic nature in which the rights of African Americans are completely overridden and ignored, in which people don't realize that there's a fundamental degree of theft, that is to say, transfer of wealth away from Black American taxpayers who fund resources for areas that have high white populations, whereas rural hospitals in areas that are predominantly Black in the South, those hospitals are more likely to close or be underfunded. And that was brought to my attention today, which is extraordinarily important because of the way in which we're prepared to be lazy about Republican anti-democratic patterns of dominance. So if Republican officials in southern states gain power because they're very effective at appealing to residual racist forms of rationalization and false hierarchies of worth, which are predicated on color, then a lot of people will be very comfortable with resources being denied to small rural Black communities. So areas where there's a high proportion of Black people, oh, whoops, we're going to not fund that public hospital anymore. And the assumption that other people make is, oh, it's the South. They voted in Republican, so they have to suffer the consequences. And we forget that Republicans are very good at minority governance. They're very good at suppressing not just the vote by Black people, but consequently the political power of Black people, the power to defend yourself from persecution. So when you have two problems, one, that some people enjoy persecuting Black Americans because their ego is sustained by a false hierarchy of worth in which they say, as a white person, I'm superior. My fellow white people are superior to Black people, and actively enjoy denying Black Americans public resources that they deserve as people who are taxpayers. And that without infrastructure, you can't have flourishing communities. You can't have flourishing businesses. So this isn't it's all about Democrats caring about justice and equality and all of these highfalutin fancy pants concepts that don't bear any relationship to the real world and to the economy and to prosperity. It very much relates to prosperity and to businesses and to the economy overall, because Republican politicians are prepared to harm their overall economy if they can just concentrate denial of economic opportunity, denial of the resources that are needed for a community to flourish both economically and psychologically, because racism is a tendency that meets with high levels of white voter endorsement. So that was something really important for me to realize, because people can often get complacent and stuck in patterns of tribal thinking. And I need to point out to the left, when succumbing to those tendencies to dismiss whole states as being Republican, so not worthy of caring about, not worthy of investing in, that we should be energized about the injustices borne by a lot of Black people in the South, because not only is their voting power diminished by the purposeful voting hostile actions of Republicans in power, but by the fact that it's not politically unpopular in southern states to deprive Black Americans of resources that they need to flourish in terms of having businesses and in terms of participating in the economy and in terms of educational achievement and having enough hospitals to adequately meet the needs of the residents of those demographically Black dominant townships, and that those townships wither and fold in on themselves when there is low investment, and that is theft, that is misdirection of taxpayer resources away from people who need it and deserve it purely because not enough people care, purely because of the politics of callousness and contempt that is racially predicated. I'm going to write that down and then hopefully put it in a blog, because I made it up. And you know what? It means something. It means something. I'm not just one more white person talking to try and give myself credentials. I'm not just a white person trying to virtue signal that I note that something bad is happening. Something bad is happening. Something bad happens all the time. But whenever we see theft, and all injustice is a form of theft, but I've decided that theft is really a word that should alert people to the significance of what is happening. That it has happened over and over again during American history, that prior to the desegregation of American schools, white children got to attend schools with good facilities, and black children didn't get to ride a school bus. They had to walk to school, they had to cross streams and chop firewood themselves to hit a classroom where there were no textbooks, or they had to try and fundraise to get their own textbooks. There has constantly been a redistribution of taxpayer funds that black working people contribute to. They contribute to the pot of taxpayer funds, but they have habitually been denied the fruits of those collectivized taxed funds, taxpayer funds. All right. So a publication that I am trying to read more of, because it's very educational for me as a white person who has not been raised in an environment that circulated awareness of these very real things. It also grates against a lot of white people's foundational stories in which they understand the world, that their parents told them, be grateful and don't complain. So when black people are persecuted, that persecution is compounded by the white response to any black person who has the audacity to speak up about it and to say, hey, this is not fair. Our communities are not receiving a proportionate share of the tax base that we contribute to. And they're then told, we don't really like listening to whiners. Be grateful. When you focus on what you're grateful for, that helps have a better life. Because sure, there's lots of reasons to promote grateful outlooks. And then there's lots of reasons to keep telling black people to just be grateful when they're actually being stolen from. And if you use loaded words like stolen and theft, then you can help break through some of the white complacency, that status quo complacency that says everything's fine and just, wake up in the morning and be grateful you're alive. Status quo complacency says, so must you make everything about race? Must you continue to insist that you're being persecuted? You sound like a crazy person. You think you're being persecuted all the time. So when white people educate themselves to ways in which this persecution is real and has manifested in various ways, big and small, for extended periods of time, and then been compounded by the denialism and the status quo complacency and status quo loyalty of so many, then you'll understand why there are some people with rage. Yep. Oh, so Knowledge El-Shabazz was really taught this stuff, because you were taught that America is the home of the thieves and the home of the slaves, not the land of the free and home of the brave. Well, The Root had an article the other day called, it was about the unusual nature of patriotism amongst Black Americans, because sometimes Black Americans have shown a very strong commitment to the ostensible founding principles of America, to say, hey, America, you don't always act this way, but it's a good principle. Somebody articulated at some point. And we're going to say we're loyal to it and promote it because it's a good ideal. And America overall would be better served if you all made an effort to stop being racist in a way that betrays your own principles and started acting in a way and voting for people in a way and legislating in a way that upholds these better principles that somebody at some point in time thought to articulate, to write down, to commemorate, and to celebrate. Christopher Lucas says something nice. He says, you do not see through rose-colored glasses. You have demonstrated repeatedly that I see, or at least attempt to see, facts. This is one of the many reasons why you will make a significant and positive contribution to America. Thanks, Christopher. I think it is important. And I know that I will sometimes feel like an imposter. And I will sometimes feel like I should just be quiet and let people with a longer immersion in American history and in American political dynamics take the stage and speak. But there will be times when I remember your comment. In fact, I'll take a photograph so I can keep it and look at it for those moments when I'm feeling like I need to connect with what drives me, because it's not as common as it needs to be. It needs to be more common that people recognize a pattern of theft. And I say that out of a degree of self-interest as well, because that pattern is replicated in other areas. That pattern of theft that is then glossed over by loyalty to the status quo. And that's the area of climate change and the intergenerational theft from our children and their future children, whereby we say, oh, well, do we really need to rock the boat about fossil fuels? Or do we really need to vote out Republicans? Maybe it's just their turn to be in power. It is imperative that we vote out Republicans. It is imperative that we rock the boat and evict those people who have sold our children down the river and sold the future of our children down the river to a significant degree, because the world is warming, because wealthy people might think, oh, well, I can protect my children from any bad outcomes of climate change by just helping them corruptly acquire so much money that then they can buy a bubble house. That's also delusional, but to a degree factually based. There is a degree to which money is protective against extreme weather events. You could say, oh, well, my children will have enough money to build a big bunker. Apparently very wealthy tech billionaires are fond of having meetings with futurists in which they say, what sort of system can I have so that my impoverished security guards don't rebel against me? Like, can I give them a neck collar so that they don't steal from my, hoarded food supplies when we've gone through the apocalypse? They're interested because on some level they're aware that there's apocalyptic potential in under-addressed climate change. The fact that the world or governments around the world should all be cooperating together to address this really critical problem, that we need to transform our energy consumption patterns and our energy technology uptake to generate energy in a different way, to upturn the status quo in a way that's not the revolution of communism, that doesn't have to be we overthrew capitalism and reverted to living in caves. A lot of people who are protective of the status quo want to protect against the far left, which sometimes does sound like they're anti-population and anti-technology, and they do just want to go and live a simple lifestyle. I wanted that too when I was a know-nothing adolescent, because when somebody teaches me something, I learn it at an emotional level. And in school, they taught me, mistakenly, just take a drink. They mistakenly taught me, or at least gave me the impression, that the world population was increasing. and that this was tied to the entrenched nature of environmental problems, that overpopulation was the cause. And that's a very depressing thing to teach young people, and I think you'll find it's a foundational plank of a lot of young people's depressive tendencies. When you're taught that human population is a cause for existential negative outcomes and for potential apocalypses, you're deprived of a lot of joy of human existence. You can't celebrate the birth of children. You can't aspire to having children. You're robbed a lot of happy anticipation, and instead you feel fearful and negative about a lot of the things that are human and generate human joy. I'm going to go for today because I've got some kind of cough thing happening. But I've been talking for an hour and 25 minutes. Chris Tuttle, America's man. I said vote out Republicans. Republicans are the obstacle to transforming America's energy sector. They're the obstacle to American leadership to compel China, or to help lead China in a direction that celebrates renewable energy and transformative energy usage, and not still competing to have coal or gas, fossil fuel consumption patterns. Michelle says, American discourse is on a lower level than is your style of communication. Most Americans are ignorant of even basic history, which is why your broadcasts are a breath of fresh air. Thank you, Shell Lady. I'm so appreciative of your positive feedback. Chris Tuttle, before I go, I'll just have to explain to you why you're really wrong and mistaken, and you subscribe to something that is not only outdated, but really harmful. And when I say outdated, I mean outdated from decades and decades and decades ago, when the Democratic Party was home to the Dixiecrat racists. It's not the case now. Joe Biden is transforming American energy patterns by subsidizing the generation of renewable technologies and not subsidizing fossil fuel executives anymore, because billions of American taxpayer dollars are funneled towards maintaining and expanding the profits of corrupt fossil fuel executives. They're like the tobacco industry, but they're poisoning your children and not just smokers. They're poisoning your children, and they are jeopardizing your children's future because it's potentially overwhelming to the insurance industry. It's a significant militaristic threat to America to have all of its structure imperiled by increasingly frequent and severe extreme weather events. So even more and more Republican voters are coming on board with the idea now that the climate problem needs to be addressed. So Pitbull, who's a real American patriot news, just subscribed. I'm gonna write that name down, check that person out. Pitbull, eh? Yeah. Chris Tuttle says many Democrats have mental problems. Picking one side is delusional. Look, a lot of people are independents in America. American voting bloc of independents is bigger than the group of Republicans or Democrats. It's healthy to keep American politics honest, but I think what you'll find is a lot of independents are essentially Republicans who aren't prepared to publicly admit that they're Republicans, because they understand that it's kind of synonymous with grandchild jeopardizing, earth imperiling, racist, selfish voting patterns. People who understand that Trump is bad, but who voted for him anyway because they thought that would be healthier for their tax pockets if they continued to benefit from tax cuts that gave and gave to the wealthiest subset of Americans. Yeah, so Chris Tuttle is a super racist, which is obvious from the moment you come in here and chortle your little Republican talking points to say that Democratic voters have a mental illness, rather than the truth, which is that Democrats are more likely than Republican voters to engage with reality in relation to science, in relation to climate science, in relation to biological science and pandemic science, and in relation to historical reality, namely the recent insurrection instigated and propelled by Donald J. Trump and his cronies, Rudy Giuliani, Jared Kushner, William Barr, a whole bunch of people who will hopefully see prison time. But of course, we know the American justice system has a lot of constraints on the free functioning of the law. So fingers crossed, and there do seem to be a lot of people who are at different layers of the justice system who are working on addressing Trump's crimes in trying to corrupt election officials in Georgia, avoiding taxes by falsely inflating his empire to banks when he was trying to get a loan, and underrating his assets when he came to communicating with the Internal Revenue Service. Yeah, I discuss racism a lot, so I have a very good appreciation of the different types of racism, namely racism which is actively hostile to people of color, and racism which is merely callous but just as deadly, because callousness at a policy level, when embedded within a political party, both in terms of their voters and their officials, do things like direct resources away from communities and underserved communities, which subsequently die at high rates or receive poorer medical care, or basically just the type of Republicans or Republican-leaning independents who refuse to wear masks or accept the reality that Donald Trump was a seditious traitor and self-serving criminal who lied about the pandemic and lied about the science of mask wearing and concealed the fact that he knew COVID was airborne purely to try and increase his chances of holding on to the illegitimate power that he won in 2016 through accepting the help of and cooperating with the Russian government. I nearly substituted Republican for Russian then, but you know what? There's a lot of funding overlap. So thanks for bringing your little racist butt here, Chris Tuttle, but you're a bad person, unfortunately, at this moment in time. You might get better, I don't know, but good luck. Good luck with your journey. We all have journeys, and it's important to be empathetic. So a lot of what I say, I bring receipts to anchor what I'm saying in objective truth. So I'm used to little trolley people who don't have a very strong relationship with reality turning up and just spouting off criticisms that all arise from a place of emotion. Like, sure, what I say can't be true because it would hurt your feelings for you to be wrong, for you to be deceiving yourself about Trump, about Republicans and how they mostly organize tax cuts for their donors and their wealthy class of friends, and block and provide obstacles to legislation that would actually and does actually help the American economy, American businesses, American individuals, American families, and American communities. So you're on the side of the people that harm things, and particularly when you subscribe to dangerously adversarial rhetoric like saying Democrats are mentally ill. That's not a fact-based statement. That's just a way of being unduly dismissive about the only people who've been prepared to vote in politicians who face up to the problems that face humanity, that face people in developed countries, that face people of conscience who are prepared to engage with science, engage with historical reality, and indeed with current reality. So I'll say thank you to Marsha for your insightful award. That is very much appreciated. Love you, Marsha. Thank you to Mr. 2 Extra. That's cool. I got a Stay Safe award. And he said, hello, Queen. Nobody's ever said that to me before, so that's nice. Knowledge, so lovely to see you. I'll have to come drop by in one of your drumming sessions sometime. Let me know. Knowledge said there is also an unsung verse in the national anthem of America that's very racist, but they taught us, they omitted part of your own national anthem to ignore that part of history. So I'll have to look that up. Knowledge and the racist unsung verse. We'll look it up and then we'll come back with receipts about that next time, because here we love receipts. We love data that anchors our assertions and our opinions to some part of reality that is demonstrably factual. And we don't just fabricate evidence. We don't just keep repeating talking points to ourselves to assure ourselves that we're never wrong and that Trump is indeed a demigod worthy of worship. We don't do that here. So cheers, everybody. Thanks so much for your time. Knowledge is going to let me know. Dawn just subscribed. Marsha says, love and appreciate you too. Thank you, Marsha. Christopher says, take care. Knowledge is going to let me know when his drumming is. Thanks, Knowledge. Maybe I should look you up so I can follow you on Twitter. Are you on Twitter, darling? @Knowledge _Shabazz. He says, thanks so much for sharing. My absolute pleasure. Lovely to talk to you all as always. Bye, everyone. Bye, Marsha, Christopher, Knowledge. Cheers, everyone.